Welcome to the Deep Dive. Before we begin analyzing today's material, I want to take a moment to warmly welcome you.
Yes, we are so glad you're joining us today.
And I really want to offer a divine blessing for your day and, honestly, for the entire week ahead of you.
Absolutely.
May your week be filled with light, clarity, and a profound sense of purpose in whatever you set your hands to do.
That is a beautiful way to start. We really have an incredible text ahead of us today.
We really do. Today, the mission of our deep dives is to unpack the dense, highly strategic text of Exodus chapter 6.
Which is such a turning point.
It is. We are drawing on the extensive historical and theological insights from the Holman and NAA Study Bibles. Now, we all know the broader Exodus narrative, but chapter 6 is pivotal. It acts as this decisive theological reset.
Right, because if you look at the context, Moses has just failed.
Miserably
failed in his initial demand to Pharaoh. The Israelite foremen are furious with him. The brick quotas are exactly the same, but the straw was taken away.
They are crushed under the weight of this slavery, and Pharaoh is just entirely unyielding.
And the study notes point out that God responds to this absolute rock-bottom moment, not with, a simple pep talk.
Right, he doesn't just say, hang in there.
No, he responds with a complex legal and historical declaration of war.
It really reminds me of those moments in life when you feel like you are doing exactly what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
But everything is still going terribly wrong.
Yeah.
You take a step of faith, and the situation immediately gets worse.
That framing is so essential for understanding Moses here. He stepped into the court of the most powerful empire on earth, spoke truth to power, and the immediate result was a systemic crackdown.
It's brutal.
It really is. The narrative up to this point has been entirely dominated by Pharaoh's stubbornness and his apparent absolute control over the region.
Which makes the opening of chapter 6 so striking to me. God does not negotiate with Pharaoh's stubbornness.
Not at all.
In verse 1, God introduces a completely overwhelming counterforce. He calls it his mighty hand.
Yes, the mighty hand.
The text explicitly states that because of this mighty hand, Pharaoh won't just politely permit the Israelites to leave. He is going to be forcefully compelled to drive them out of his own land.
It is a total subversion of the political reality. Pharaoh thinks he's the one dictating terms.
Right.
But the introduction of the mighty hand signals that the Egyptian king is about to become an unwitting participant in Yahweh's larger design.
He's actually going to initiate the eviction.
Exactly. The expulsion of the Israelites won't be a quiet escape in the middle of the night. It will be an eviction initiated by the oppressor himself, entirely due to the pressure of that divine hand.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more because building on that shift in momentum, the text moves right into a profound declaration of identity in verses 2 and 3.
This is where it gets really interesting theologically.
Yes. God tells Moses that she appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, meaning God Almighty. But then he drops this highly debated caveat.
He says that by his name Yahweh or the Lord, he was not known to them.
Which is wild, because anyone who has read the book of Genesis knows that the patriarchs absolutely use the name Yahweh.
It's written all throughout their narrative.
So what's going on here? Did they just forget?
The Holman study notes provide a brilliant resolution to what initially looks like a glaring textual contradiction.
Right, it looks like a mistake.
But the scholars suggest this is not about the patriarchs being ignorant of the literal word Yahweh.
They knew the syllables.
Exactly. They knew the word, but they had not experienced the profound, covenant-fulfilling meaning of that specific name.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
As El Shaddai, the ancestors experienced God's overarching provision, his blessings, and the establishment of the initial promises. But the name Yahweh carries the weight of a deeply personal, active, covenant-keeping reality.
It's a completely different level of intimacy.
It is. The patriarchs lived as nomads. They received the promise of the land and the nation, but they died long before seeing those promises materialized.
I like to think of it as like the difference between knowing of a celebrity versus knowing them personally as a close friend.
That's a great way to put it.
Or like the difference between holding a signed contract and actually watching the funds hit your bank account.
Yes.
The patriarchs held the contract. They knew the promise. But Moses and the enslaved Israelites are about to see the contract executed.
They are going to witness the active, historical fulfillment of that agreement under the name Yahweh.
And this transition from promise to execution is perfectly captured in verse 5. God states that he has heard the groaning of the Israelites and has remembered his covenant.
Now, we need to clarify that term.
Yes, please do. Because the concept of God remembering is frequently misunderstood. It sounds like a lapse in divine memory has suddenly been corrected.
Like, he just suddenly remembered them down in the mud pits of Egypt.
Exactly, like he tied a string around his finger and finally noticed it. But the biblical context is far more robust than that.
The commentary is emphatic on this point. In ancient Near Eastern treaty language, remembering is a dynamic, legal term.
It's a legal activation.
Precisely. It means initiating action in strict accordance with a previous agreement. It doesn't mean he forgot. It means he is now stepping into history to act.
He is initiating action in accordance with his promises.
Yes, the agonizing groans of the enslaved Israelites serve as the catalyst for the covenant, moving from a dormant state of promise into an active state of execution.
And the execution of that covenant is detailed immediately. In verses 6 through 8, God gives Moses this rapid-fire sequence of declarations.
The I will statements.
Yes, I love these. It's just back-to-back promises. I will bring you out, I will deliver you, I will redeem you, I will take you as my own people.
The NAA Study Notes classify this specific sequence as the formula of recognition.
Formula of recognition. That emphasizes a really deeply personal relationship.
It does. It's the structural cornerstone of the entire Exodus event. Surrounding these promises is the repeated phrase, I am the Lord. God is outlining the exact architectural blueprint of their upcoming salvation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the word redeem in that sequence carries a fascinating amount of historical weight.
It really changes how you read the passage.
To a modern listener, redemption often sounds like a purely spiritual metaphor, like going to church and feeling redeemed.
Right.
But the study Bibles clarify that redeem here translates an ancient, highly specific legal term.
The kinsman redeemer.
Yes. Can you explain how that worked culturally?
So in that ancient cultural context, if an individual fell into crushing poverty or was sold into slavery, their closest male relative possessed a legal and moral obligation to pay the necessary price.
To literally buy them back.
Exactly, to buy them back from slavery or debt and restore their freedom. They were the family protector.
So by using the language of the kinsman redeemer, God is making this radical theological statement. He's claiming the Israelites as family.
He is legally adopting a nation of foreign slaves as his own kin. Yahweh is declaring to the Egyptian empire that these people are his family, and he has come to pay their ransom.
Okay, and the method of that redemption is where the historical context becomes truly brilliant.
This is the biggest aha moment of the whole chapter.
I completely agree. God declares he will redeem them with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Tell us about this outstretched arm.
The Holman notes dive deep into Egyptian art and literature to explain this. In ancient Egyptian propaganda, Pharaoh was obsessively depicted in battle armor with an outstretched arm.
Like holding a weapon over his enemies.
Exactly, a mace or a sword. It was the ultimate, inescapable visual symbol of tyrannical supremacy. You would find the image of Pharaoh's outstretched arm carved into towering stone monuments, painted onto temple walls everywhere.
It was designed to communicate that the Egyptian king's power was absolute and divine.
Yes. The message was that no one could escape the outstretched arm of Pharaoh.
So the author of Exodus is showing God deliberately co-opting the empire's own propaganda.
God is deliberately using this specific imagery to mock Pharaoh.
He's flipping the script.
Completely flipping the script. Proving that he possesses the true power, not the Egyptian king. The true outstretched arm belongs to Yahweh.
That is a masterclass in psychological warfare.
It really is, and this directly informs the great judgments mentioned in the same breath.
The 10 plagues.
Right. The commentary highlights that the great judgments weren't just random environmental disasters. They were highly targeted strikes against the specific gods of the Egyptian pantheon.
Proving Yahweh's supremacy over everything Egypt held sacred.
Yes. The Nile turning to blood was a direct assault on the god of the annual flooding. The darkness dismantled the supreme sun god. Yahweh's outstretched arm systematically dismantled their entire religious infrastructure.
So Moses is handed this comprehensive, empowering message. He has the promise of legal adoption, the destruction of their oppressors, the new land. He takes this back to the Israelites.
Expecting it to ignite a fire of hope.
But then we get this tragic reality check in verse 9. Moses delivers the message, and the Israelites completely ignore him.
They just can't hear it.
And the text gives a very specific psychological reason. It says it was because of their anguish of spirit and their harsh slavery.
It's an incredibly profound, validating moment for human trauma.
It really is.
The literal Hebrew translation describes it as a shortness of spirit. The physical, emotional, and psychological weight of generational slavery had entirely eradicated their capacity to envision a different future.
When you are entirely consumed by the daily, agonizing struggle for survival.
Making bricks without straw.
Right. Making bricks under the threat of a whip. Grand promises about future real estate and divine adoption simply sound like static.
It's incredibly difficult for a person to absorb messages of hope when they are entirely consumed by trauma and exhaustion.
The trauma creates this impenetrable barrier to receiving good news.
And Moses immediately uses this as an out.
He does. He takes their brokenness and uses it as an excuse for himself.
In verses 10 through 12, God tells Moses to go back and speak to Pharaoh. And Moses counters with what he thinks is airtight logic.
He says, if my own people won't listen to me, how on earth will Pharaoh?
Right.
And then he claims he has uncircumcised lips.
Which is such a strange metaphor to our modern ears. It really is. What does he mean by uncircumcised lips?
The notes explain that uncircumcised in this biblical poetry context implies something unrefined, faltering, or inept at its intended function.
So he's claiming a lack of speaking skill.
A speech impediment, perhaps. But the NLA notes suggest the metaphor runs deeper. Circumcision was the ultimate sign of covenantal purity.
Ah, so it's not just physical.
No. By claiming his lips are uncircumcised, Moses may be expressing a deep-seated feeling of moral or personal impurity.
He feels entirely unfit for this holy divine mandate.
He's hyperfixated on his own perceived inadequacies instead of trusting the mighty hand that God just promised.
Which brings us to a fascinating literary pivot, right at the height of Moses' insecurity.
Right when he's complaining. The narrative abruptly halts. In verse 13, the text just hits the brakes and inserts a lengthy genealogy.
A long list of family names right in the middle of the dramatic climax.
It feels like an editorial mistake when you first read it.
It does, but the NAA notes describe this as a deliberate sandwich structure.
A structural sandwich. I love that term.
It's a great literary technique. God gives the command in verse 13, that's the top piece of bread.
Then followed by the genealogy in verses 14 through 25. The meat.
The meat of the sandwich. And then he repeats the exact same command in verses 26 and 27. The bottom piece of bread.
It builds suspense for the reader.
It builds suspense, but it also serves a critical legal function. It validates their credentials.
Why these specific names, though?
Well, it starts with the firstborn sons, Reuben and Simeon, to establish the historical order, but it quickly bypasses them to zero in entirely on Levi.
Because Levi is the patriarchal head of the tribe of Moses and Aaron.
Exactly. The whole point is to establish the legitimate historical credentials of these two men, and especially Aaron, surprisingly.
Yeah, the genealogy heavily weights toward Aaron's lineage, right?
Yes, it meticulously traces his descendants to lay the foundational legal framework for the future priesthood of Israel. It specifically highlights figures like Korah and Phinehas.
Korah, who later leads a rebellion.
Right. And Phinehas, whose zeal secures the perpetual priesthood. The text is anchoring these future historical realities right here before the Exodus even begins.
Proving that the men confronting Pharaoh aren't just random dissidents.
They are the legally and historically verified representatives of the covenant.
And there is a brilliant linguistic detail at the conclusion of this genealogy. When the text reiterates the command for Moses and Aaron to lead the Israelites out, it refers to them leaving according to their armies.
That choice of military terminology is just extraordinary.
They are currently a broken mob of slaves.
Covered in mud, broken spirits, no weapons.
But God is already speaking of them using military terms.
He is not defining them by their current state of brutalization. He is defining them by their future destiny.
Viewing them as an organized, victorious force.
Before the conflict has even escalated.
Wow. Bringing all these threads together, this deep dive shows us a God who actively remembers his promises.
A God who executes ancient legal covenants.
A divine strategist who flips the propaganda of earthly superpowers on its head. And a God who patiently works with broken, insecure people.
He doesn't abandon the Israelites when their trauma blocks their faith. And he doesn't discard Moses when he's focused on his uncircumcised lips.
Which relates directly back to your life today. As you were listening to this, there are likely moments when you feel entirely unequipped and insecure, much like Moses.
offering up a dozen logical reasons why you were the wrong person for the task.
Or maybe you are in a season where you feel too crushed by circumstances to hear good news, just like the Israelites.
The trauma is just too loud.
Yet this text reminds us that the outstretched arm of redemption is working behind the scenes. God views you not as broken, but as an organized, empowered force.
He equips you for the very things you feel incapable of handling.
Exactly. Now, as we prepare to close out, I want to hand it over to you for one final provocative thought for our listener to mull over.
Well, thinking about the commentary's exploration of Egyptian propaganda, it raises a really compelling question.
Let's hear it.
If the divine outstretched arm brilliantly co-opted and dismantled the terrifying, inescapable cultural narratives of the ancient world.
The propaganda of Pharaoh.
Right. What modern, unstoppable forces or cultural narratives might we be giving entirely too much power to in our own lives today? What is the modern Pharaoh in your life that needs to be reminded of the true mighty hand?
That is a phenomenal question to reflect on as you navigate your week. Consider what forces you might be granting unnecessary authority over your perspective.
It changes everything when you view it through the lens of the kinsman redeemer.
It really does. Thank you for joining us as we explore the incredible depths of Exodus chapter 6. We are officially signing off for today, and as you step into whatever is next, we want you to know that God blesses all the listeners.
Have a wonderful week.
Catch you on the next Deep Dive.